For 32 years, I let one truck decide how my family saw me. Old, embarrassing, something to be quietly upgraded away. And I want you to sit with that word, embarrassing, for a second, because I spent 3 decades as a machinist and then a plant owner, and in that trade, you learn something most people never learn, which is that the parts that look the roughest on the outside are often the ones machined to the tightest tolerance underneath, and the parts that look shiny and perfect are usually the ones that fail first under real pressure. My name is Dolores. Everyone calls me D. I built Reyes Precision Machining out of a failing 2-bay shop I bought with everything I had at 34 years old. And I still drive the same pickup truck I bought used the year my son was born. And I promise you, nothing I learned in 30 years of running that floor prepared me for the Thanksgiving my daughter-in-law mocked that truck in front of her whole family, or for the Tuesday, 4 months later, when she walked into my plant for her first day of work and saw whose name was bolted to the wall by the loading dock. I didn't know it yet, but the 2 taps I always give a wrench against my palm before I use it, a habit 30 years old, was going to be the exact thing that told an old friend of mine exactly who was standing in his lobby before I ever said a word. I didn't know it yet, but the small brass plaque beside that loading dock, the one stamped with my maiden name instead of the name my family knew me by, was going to end up under my daughter-in-law's own hand on her very first week of work. And I didn't know it yet, but the old truck Vanessa mocked at that Thanksgiving table was going to be the exact vehicle idling in the parking lot the day she finally understood whose signature was on her own paycheck. It was coming. We just didn't know the Tuesday. Let me take you back, because you need to understand what that truck actually meant before you can understand what happened at my son's table. I married young, to a man who left when Eric was 4, and I spent the next several years working the night shift at a machine shop outside town, running lathes and mills for a boss named Sal, who taught me more about tolerances and patience than either of my parents ever managed to teach me about anything. I bought that pickup truck used the year Eric was born, mostly because it was the only vehicle I could afford that would also start reliably at 4 in the morning in January. I drove it to night classes after my shift, drove it to Eric's school when he was sick, drove it, eventually, the day I finally scraped together enough to make an offer on Sal's shop when he wanted to retire and nobody else wanted to take on his debt. That's the wound, in a way, though it doesn't look like most wounds. Write it down anyway, because everything that happens later traces back to those years in that truck. Sal used to tell me that a machine only respects 2 things, patience and repetition, and that everything else people call skill is really just those 2 things stacked up over enough mornings that nobody's counting anymore. I believed him the way you believe someone who's already lived the thing you're only starting to attempt. I ran that shop floor for 6 years before I ever owned a square foot of it, learning to read a blueprint the way some people read a face, learning which vibration in a spindle meant something was about to go wrong 3 weeks before it actually would. I brought Eric in on Saturdays sometimes, set him up in the corner office with a coloring book while I finished a run, and even then I noticed how he watched the machines more than he watched me. The way children do when they're trying to understand what's actually holding a family together. I built the shop into Reyes Precision Machining over the following 3 decades, into something that eventually supplied precision parts to aerospace contractors and automotive suppliers across 2 states. I kept the name Reyes on the company because it was my father's name, a man who ran a machine shop himself for 40 years and never once made it past a two-person operation, and putting his name on something bigger felt like the only inheritance I had left to give him. When I remarried, years later to a good man named Walter Hines, I took his name socially, the way you do, D. Hines at church, D. Hines on the school forms when Eric still needed a parent's signature, D. Hines everywhere except the one place that actually mattered to me, which was the paperwork with my father's name on it. Eric grew up watching his mother leave before dawn in an old truck and come home smelling like cutting oil. The same way some kids grow up watching a parent leave for a job they never fully explain. And I never corrected the story he built for himself, which was that his mother worked hard at a company, not that she owned one. I told myself I'd explain it properly someday when the moment felt right. I kept telling myself that for longer than I probably should have. What Eric didn't know, and what his wife Vanessa certainly didn't know when she married him 3 years ago, was that the woman driving a truck with 240,000 miles on it to Thanksgiving dinner had signed the mortgage on the building that plant sat inside of twice, first as a two-bay shop, and again, 15 years later, when it tripled in size. Vanessa came from a family that had money once, real money, a father who ran a chain of small real estate offices when she was a teenager, until the market turned against him the year she was 15, and the whole thing collapsed in under 18 months. She remembered exactly what it looked like when a truck came for both of their cars in the same week. Remembered the particular hollow sound of a garage with nothing parked inside it, and she had spent every year since building a life that made absolutely certain nobody could ever again mistake her for a person whose garage might go empty. It was the Thursday before Thanksgiving. The whole extended family gathered at Eric and Vanessa's new house. When Vanessa's parents pulled into the driveway behind my truck, and I watched Vanessa's face do something small and tight before she'd even said hello to me. At dinner, over dessert, with Vanessa's mother mentioning the leased sedan she'd just upgraded to, Vanessa turned to me, half laughing, and said, "Honestly, Dee, I don't know how you still drive that thing. It looks like it's actively falling apart in the driveway. We really should help you get something more, I don't know, respectable, before my parents think we don't take care of our own family." The table laughed the way tables do at a joke that isn't quite a joke. I said something light about the truck starting every morning without complaint, which was more than I could say for some newer vehicles, and the conversation moved on. But I noticed, the way you notice a hairline crack in a casting before it fails, that Vanessa's eyes went to that truck twice more before the night was over, each time with the exact same flicker of something that looked less like judgment and more like fear. This is where I want to pause for a moment, because I think it's worth asking honestly why we let one object carry so much weight in a family. That truck was never actually about the truck. It carried 30 years of 4 in the morning shifts for me, and it apparently carried something entirely different, something much more frightened, for Vanessa, and neither one of us said a word about what we were actually looking at. I drove that truck home that night, the way I always did, 2 taps of the key against the dashboard out of an old habit I couldn't tell you the origin of anymore, and I thought, not for the first time, that there was a version of this family where I simply told everyone the truth about the last 30 years and skipped all of this entirely. I didn't do it. Not that year. Before we go further, If you're the kind of person who notices what an old car parked in a driveway is actually saying underneath the jokes somebody makes about it, go ahead and hit subscribe on Pretty Family Revenge right now so you don't lose this one halfway through. Get comfortable, because what happened 4 months after that Thanksgiving table is the part I still think about most, and it changed how my son's marriage worked for good. Comment where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now let's get back to it, because Vanessa was about to take a new job, and neither of us had any idea yet how small the world she was about to walk into actually was. It was the second week of February when Vanessa mentioned at Sunday dinner that she'd accepted a marketing and communications position at a manufacturing company outside the city. A solid step up, benefits, room to grow, exactly the kind of respectable she'd been chasing since she was 15 years old. The company was called Reyes Precision Machining. She said the name the way you say any unfamiliar name, with no weight behind it at all, because Reyes had never once been the name she'd heard attached to me. I didn't know it yet, but the plaque bolted beside the loading dock at that plant, the one stamped founded by D. Reyes, 1992, was about to sit less than 40 feet from Vanessa's new desk for months before she ever noticed it was there. It was around then that Hal started noticing things nobody else in that building was in a position to notice, and this is where the story gets its second thread. Hal had run the floor for me for 26 years, had known me since the 2 Bay days, had watched me sign every version of that plaque personally. When the new hire packet came across his desk with Vanessa's name on it, he didn't connect it right away, married names being what they are, but he mentioned her at the Friday supervisor meeting, almost in passing, said the new marketing hire seemed sharp, mentioned her husband's name was Eric, and something in the way he said Eric made me go very still. I asked Hal, carefully, not to say anything to her yet. I wasn't ready. 30 years of letting my own family believe a simpler story than the truth had made me slower than I should have been to correct it, even now, even with the door standing wide open in front of me. I didn't know it yet, but the 2 taps I gave a wrench against my palm the next time I walked the floor, an old habit from my earliest years at that machine, was exactly the detail Hal would use, weeks later, to point Vanessa's own eyes toward the truth before I'd worked up the nerve to say it myself. Most people watching this never do what I'm about to ask. But if this story has you leaning forward even a little, hit that like button now. It genuinely tells this channel to keep finding stories like this one, and it costs you about 1 second of your night. For 2 months, I stayed away from the front offices entirely, walking the floor early before the office staff arrived, the way I'd always preferred anyway. Vanessa settled into her role, mentioned the company at dinner with a new kind of pride, said the owner sounded like an interesting woman, quiet, apparently kept mostly to the production floor, which struck her as unusual for someone who owned the whole operation. I sat across from my son at those dinners, holding that information in my mouth like a part I hadn't quite finished machining yet, not ready to release it into the world before I trusted the tolerance. Hal checked in with me most Fridays that spring, not pushing, just letting me know how she was settling in. He told me she'd started asking sharp questions in the marketing meetings about the actual machines, wanting real photographs instead of stock images for a brochure, wanting to understand what a 5-axis mill actually did before she wrote a single sentence describing it. He said it reminded him of somebody else he used to know, 30 years back, who'd wanted to understand every machine on that floor before she ever trusted herself to run one alone. I told him to keep that comparison to himself a while longer. He said he'd been holding plenty of things to himself for 26 years on my account, and he supposed he could hold one more for a couple more weeks. It was a Tuesday in June when Hal finally walked Vanessa past the loading dock during a facility tour for new hires, the same tour he'd given 100 times, and paused, the way I now understand he'd been quietly planning to pause, right beside that brass plaque. He asked her, casually, if she'd ever met the founder. She said no, actually. She'd been curious about that. Hal told her the founder still came in most mornings, ran a wrench through her hand exactly twice before she used it, same as she had for 30 years, and that her name was right there on the wall if she wanted to read it herself. We're at the part of the story most people watch these videos for, the part where the truth finally lands and the room sees clearly, but I want you to notice something before we get there. Being seen clearly for the first time by someone who's spent years underestimating you doesn't feel like winning. It feels like standing in a doorway you've kept locked for so long you almost forgot what was actually on the other side of it. Vanessa read that plaque 3 times, she told me later, before the letters D. Ria's rearranged themselves into a shape she recognized, and even then, she didn't fully believe it until she walked out to the small gravel lot reserved for senior staff and saw my truck parked in its usual spot. The same truck she'd mocked 7 months earlier at her own Thanksgiving table. She called Eric from the parking lot before she called me. He told me later that she was almost breathless, asking him, over and over, did you know? Did you actually know? And Eric, to his credit, told her honestly that he hadn't, not really, not the full shape of it, that his mother had always kept the company at arm's length from the family the same way she kept most things at arm's length, quietly, out of habit, rather than deception. I met Vanessa in the small office off the production floor an hour later. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before she came in, the same way you stand at the edge of a piece of equipment you're not sure you're qualified to operate yet. She asked me directly why I'd never told her. I told her the truth, that I'd built this place so slowly and so privately that at some point the silence itself became the shape of my life, easier to maintain than to explain, and that somewhere along the way I'd let my own son grow up believing his mother simply worked hard at a job instead of understanding what she'd actually built. And I'd never quite found the sentence that would fix that without sounding like I was asking for credit I didn't need. And here's the twist in this story that I didn't see coming, even after 30 years of thinking I understood every tolerance hiding inside a piece of metal. Because when Vanessa finally sat down across from me in that small office, she wasn't only there to apologize for the truck. She told me, quiet, shaking slightly, about the week her father's real estate business collapsed when she was 15, about the truck that came for both of their cars within the same 18 months, about standing in a garage with nothing in it and understanding, at 15, that respectability could be repossessed as easily as anything else you thought you owned. She said my old truck in her driveway hadn't looked embarrassing to her the way she'd made it sound. It had looked exactly like the week her whole family lost everything, parked right there at her own Thanksgiving table, and she'd panicked and reached for the nearest sharp thing in the room, which happened to be me, without ever stopping to ask what that truck might actually represent to the person driving it. That's the wound underneath the wound. I had spent 30 years staying quiet about what I'd built because the silence felt safer than the explaining. Vanessa had spent half her life terrified of anything that looked like the poverty that once swallowed her family whole. So terrified that she couldn't tell the difference between an old truck driven out of discipline and one driven out of desperation. I want to pause here for a moment because I think this is the actual center of the story, more than the plaque, more than the parking lot. Two people can stand next to the exact same object, an old truck, a worn wrench, and see two entirely different decades of their lives reflected back at them, and neither person is wrong about what they're seeing, they're just reading two different sets of tolerances. I didn't hesitate once I understood what Vanessa had actually been carrying. I reached across that small desk and took her hand, the same hand that had gestured at my truck across a dinner table months earlier. And I told her the truck stayed exactly where it was, not as a lesson, not as a point I needed to prove, but because it was the vehicle that had carried me to night classes and hospital visits and a mortgage signing that changed my whole family's life, and I wasn't in the business of retiring the things that had actually done the work. Vanessa said the truest thing she said that whole afternoon. She said, "I think I needed you to look poor, Dee, because if you weren't, I had to admit that surviving what happened to my family didn't actually require becoming a different kind of person, it just required getting back up, and some part of me has been too scared to believe that was really true." Eric started riding along with me on early floor walks after that, watching Hal show him machines his mother had run for 30 years before he ever thought to ask what any of it actually did. Vanessa asked, a few weeks later, if she could ride out to the plant early one morning in my truck instead of her own car, just to see what the drive used to feel like at 4 in the morning in January. And I told her it mostly felt like cold hands and a radio that only picked up one station, and she laughed, really laughed, the first time I'd heard her laugh without any performance folded into it since I'd known her. I didn't know it yet, standing at that Thanksgiving table, watching Vanessa's eyes flick toward my truck for the third time that night, that the exact same vehicle would end up parked in a gravel lot months later, quietly finishing an argument neither of us had actually started yet, but I've learned, across 3 decades on a machine floor, that a part rarely fails for the reason people assume when they're only looking at the surface. It fails, or it holds, based on something built in far earlier, usually somewhere nobody thought to look closely enough. The rest of that year didn't turn into some grand unveiling with balloons and speeches, and I think that's the most honest part of this story. It turned quiet instead. Vanessa kept her job at the plant, good at it, genuinely good at it, and stopped mentioning respectable the way she used to, the words simply dropping out of her vocabulary the way words do once the fear underneath them finally gets named out loud. Eric and I had the kind of long overdue conversations about the last 30 years that we probably should have had a decade earlier, sitting in the cab of that truck more often than not, because something about that particular seat seemed to make the truth easier to say out loud. I still drive that truck, still tap the key twice against the dash before I start it. Out of a habit, I no longer feel any need to explain or apologize for. Vanessa has a photo now, on her desk at the plant, of my truck parked outside the very first 2-bay shop, taken the year Sal sold it to me, and she told me she keeps it there not as a reminder of where I came from, but as a reminder of what actually survives when everything around a person falls apart, which is usually a lot more than either of us had given ourselves credit for. The last time all 3 of us were together, I watched Eric teach Vanessa how to check a part against its tolerance using the same gauge Sal once taught me on. Both of them leaning over the same bench where I used to work double shifts alone. She kept overcorrecting at first, and he kept showing her again, patiently, the exact way you show someone you finally trust to hold something precise without either of you flinching. If this story moved you tonight, stay close, because families like this one, the quiet ones, carrying an old truck's worth of history underneath a joke nobody meant quite as cruelly as it landed, are exactly what this channel is built around. Subscribe to Pretty Family Revenge so you don't miss the next one, and tell me in the comments, honestly, is there something ordinary in your own family that's actually been carrying more weight than anyone ever said out loud? I'll see you in the next story.